Paul's letter to the Colossians. It was written during one of Paul the Apostle's many imprisonments for announcing Jesus as the risen Lord. And the letter is addressed to a group of people that Paul had never met who made up a church community that he didn't start. This church in Colossae was started by a co-worker of Paul's named Epaphras, who was actually from that city. And Epaphras had recently visited Paul in prison, and he updated him on how well the Colossians were doing overall, but he also mentioned some of the cultural pressures tempting them to turn away from Jesus. And so Paul wrote this letter to encourage the Colossians to address the issues that Epaphras had raised, and then to challenge them to a greater devotion to Jesus. The letter's design and flow of thought are pretty easy to follow. The opening movement focuses on Jesus as the exalted Messiah. Paul then goes on to show how his suffering in prison is for the exalted Jesus. And then he addresses the pressures tempting the Colossians to turn away from Jesus. After this, he explores the new way of life that Jesus' resurrection opened up for them. So the letter opens with two prayers. Paul first thanks God that he learned from Epaphras that the Colossians have been totally faithful to Jesus, showing love for God and their neighbors, all because of the hope they have in the new creation that Jesus has in store. And so he moves on to pray that they would grow in their wisdom and understanding about Jesus. And then Paul has placed a poem here to help the Colossians and us do exactly that. It's the centerpiece of chapter 1, a poem all about the crucified and exalted Messiah. It has two parallel stanzas, and it's crammed with language and imagery from the books of Genesis and Exodus, from the Psalms and the Proverbs. The first stanza explores how Jesus is the true image of God. In him, the full character and purpose of God is embodied in a human. He's the firstborn, an Old Testament phrase about Jesus' royal status over all creation. He shares in the very identity of the one true Creator God. And by him, all reality, all powers and authorities, spiritual and human, have been created. It's in Jesus the Messiah that we discover the very author and king of creation. And so in the second stanza, we discover he's also the one bringing about a new creation. He's the head of a new body, which refers to Jesus' people, who are the new humanity, of which his own resurrection existence is a prototype. In him, God's glorious temple presence dwells, and so it's through Jesus' death and resurrection that God has reconciled himself to humanity, to all spiritual powers, to all of creation. It's a remarkable poem, and Paul will keep referring back to it as he goes on in the letter. So he first shows how the truth of this poem transforms his own experience of suffering in prison. He's being punished for announcing to the Greek and the Roman world that Jesus is the resurrected Lord and King of all. And so his suffering, he thinks, is not a sign of defeat. It's actually his way of participating in Jesus' own suffering done as an act of love. And so his hardships are actually a cause for joy. He's imprisoned for the surprising news that Israel's resurrected Messiah is creating a new multi-ethnic family. And more, just as the divine glory dwelt in Jesus, so Jesus dwells in and among his international family. Or as Paul says, the Messiah is in you all, the hope of glory. Paul then addresses the cultural pressures that are tempting the Colossians to turn away from Jesus. They were confronted by a combination of mystical polytheism along with a pressure to observe the laws of the Torah. So all these new Christians, they had grown up worshiping the various Greek and Roman gods who governed different arenas of human life. And many simply included Jesus as one more deity that they could worship. There was also great pressure from the Jewish Christian community for these non-Jews to complete their commitment to the Messiah by following all of the laws found in the Torah. Specifically, he mentions eating a kosher diet, observing sacred days, and circumcision. It's very similar to the problem he addressed in the letter to the Galatians. For Paul, to give in to either of these temptations is compromise. It's a failure to grasp who Jesus really is and what he did on their behalf. The Colossians used to live in fear of spiritual powers and elemental spirits, as Paul calls them. But Jesus triumphed over these through his death and resurrection. He freed the Colossians from any obligation to them. In the same way, Jesus fulfilled on our behalf all of the laws of the Torah, which never had the power to transform the selfish human heart anyway. And so what Jesus did in his life and death and resurrection, it lacks nothing. It doesn't need to be supplemented by following the laws. He is the reality to which all of the laws of the Torah were pointing anyway. Instead of the laws, followers of Jesus have the power of his resurrection to change them, which is what he goes on to explore. Following Jesus means joining his new humanity because their lives have now been joined to the risen Jesus' life. And this is why Paul challenges the Colossians to set their minds on things above, where the Messiah is seated or rules at God's right hand. Now, Paul doesn't mean here, think about how you'll one day leave earth and go to heaven. Rather, the heavens are the transcendent place from which Jesus rules now over all of creation. And from there, he will one day return here to transform all things. Or, as Paul says, when the Messiah who is your life is revealed, you too will be revealed with him in glory. So Paul challenges them to live in the present as the kinds of new humans they will one day become. He uses the image of their old humanity, characterized by distorted sexuality and destructive speech. For Christians, that humanity died with Jesus and has been replaced by his own new humanity, which is characterized by mercy and generosity, by forgiveness and love. And this humanity, it transcends the ethnic and social boundary lines of our world to create, in Paul's words, a people where there is no one Greek or Jewish, circumcised or uncircumcised, slave or free, but the Messiah is all and is in all people. Paul then gets really practical, and he shows the Colossians what this new humanity might look like in a first-century Roman household, which was a highly authoritarian institution where the male patriarch held the power of life and death over his wife and children and slaves. Not so in a Christian household. Here, the risen Jesus is the true Lord. And so, in the Lord, the wife allows her husband to become responsible for her, and the husband is subject to Jesus by loving his wife and placing her well-being above his own. In a home where Jesus is Lord, children are not objects, but are called to maturity and to respect, and parents are to raise their children with patience and understanding. Christians who are slaves are to honor their human masters precisely because they're not the real master. Jesus is. And Christians who have slaves are to understand that this slave is not their property, but rather a fellow member of Jesus' body to be honored and embraced in love. And Paul's walking a very fine line here. He is reshaping the most basic Roman institution around Jesus, who rules by his self-giving love. And so while he doesn't abolish the household structure outright, the exalted Messiah demands that it be transformed, almost beyond the point of recognition for any Roman living in Colossae. You can see this most clearly in the letter's conclusion. After a request for prayer, Paul applies these instructions about Christian slaves and masters. And we discover that Tychicus is the one carrying and reading this letter to the Colossians, and he's accompanied by a certain Onesimus, who was a former slave to a Colossian Christian named Philemon. And we discover from another letter addressed to Philemon that Onesimus had escaped from his master. It was a crime worthy of imprisonment. But Paul asks the whole church to greet Onesimus as a faithful and beloved brother in the Lord. And then in the letter to Philemon, Paul says that he should receive Onesimus no longer as a slave, but as a brother. Talk about ending the letter with a punch. So in the letter to the Colossians, Paul is inviting us to see that no part of human existence remains untouched by the loving and liberating rule of the risen Jesus. Our suffering, our temptation to compromise, our moral character, the power dynamics in our homes, all of it must be re-examined and transformed. We are invited to live in the present as if the new creation really arrived when Jesus rose from the dead. And that's what the letter to the Colossians is all about.
Paul starts this whole book, this whole letter to the church in Colossians to put Jesus in his proper perspective. There was all this stuff that was happening to this community. There was all these pressures by culture. There was all these pressures by the Jews, all these pressures to change what the gospel was doing. And this culture in the church that was happening was so influenced by outside forces that they were struggling. And the first thing that Paul does when he writes them when he talks about the gospel of Jesus, when he talks about amazing ringtones that are in church, when he talks about what's going on, he puts Jesus in the proper place. And he's saying, like, the gospel, this person, this ministry of Jesus is at the center of everything, and everything flows from him. Read this, it's on your screen, but read along with me in Colossians 1, starting in verse 15. This is what he says. He says, he, meaning Jesus, he is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn over all creation, for everything was created by him in heaven and on earth, the visible and invisible, whether thrones or dominions or rulers or authorities, all things have been created through him and for him. He, being Jesus, is before all things, and by him all things hold together. He also is the head of the body, the church. He is the beginning, the firstborn from the dead, so that he might come to have first place in everything. For God was pleased to have all of his fullness dwell in him. What a powerful statement. God was pleased to take all the fullness of who God is and place it in Jesus. He placed all of that to dwell in him, and through him to reconcile everything to himself, whether things on earth or things in heaven, by making peace through his blood shed on the cross. There is 5 verses there that is powerful. And sometimes when we read through Scripture, we read stuff like in Colossians, and I've probably read this before, but for some reason, this completely spoke to me this week. And here's why. Here's what I want you to walk away from. It's this idea that the gospel reshapes our culture. The gospel, the person of Jesus, reshapes our culture when we allow it to shape our culture. I've said this before, if you want to write it into the side of your notes or something like that, but we've talked about this before. If you want to build culture, you need 3 things. If you want to build culture, you need 3 things. You need value, plus actions, plus story. If you have what you value, those values put into action, and then hearing stories about it, it will build culture. Let me give you an example. Actually struggled with which example I would use. Because if you look at our culture today, there's things that are being built using the same things, whether we believe them or not. Take the issue right now that we have with identity. It's a hot button. Whether it's homosexuality, or whether it's kids wanting to transition, or adults wanting to transition to the opposite sex, all of this stuff. And let me just put it into practice of what this formula uses. So you take things of what you value. So what our culture is saying, is saying like we value that there's this freedom of choice. We value that whatever you want to do or however you're feeling this day, that's what you need to do. If you don't like it, if you're uncomfortable, if you're bored, then change. That's what our culture is valuing right now. Okay? So what happens? We start to put laws, we start to do things, we start to change vocabularies, we start to put these things into practice. We have to teach them in our schools. We have to teach them from our laws. We have to do this. And so what culture is doing is starting to shape it. And so you see stories about it. You see stories on social media. You see stories on the news. You see all of these reactions about what they're trying to do with culture. See, the same, though, is true if you take things that we value, things that Christ has for us. When you start to put the gospel into culture, it can start to reshape it. It starts to change the things that we value. It starts to change then the actions that we do. It starts to change then the stories that are being told. We look so many times from biblical perspectives, and sometimes we look from biblical times and biblical cultures, and there's so much that is the same, whether it is happening today or whether it happened when the scripture was written. These churches, these letters, these Christians were facing some of the same stuff that we face today. And as they were trying to build this culture centered around the gospel, Paul was trying to put into proper perspective how you build that culture, how you see the things that you value, and taking those things you value and putting them into action, and taking those actions and telling stories about it and repeating it over and over again. And that's what Paul was trying to do. But if it was easy to just do that all the time, everybody would be doing it. So as Paul writes to the church in Colossae, as he's telling them that the gospel reshapes our culture, he's telling them a few things that they need to learn. Here's something you can write down. Suffering equals participation. Suffering equals participation. Have you ever watched an Ironman triathlon? Brenda, you've probably watched them, right? Have you competed in one? Not that one? All right. I know you do like a half of one. Okay. All right. Here's what it is. If you don't know, you swim 2.4 miles, you bike 112 miles, and you run 26.2 miles. That's insane. The average time for a person to compete, and I don't know, this is just what Google says, and Google never lies, is that it's 12 hours and 35 minutes. Basically, the swimming, the 2.4 miles, is like an hour and 16 minutes. The biking, 112 miles, is about 6 hours and 25 minutes. And then the running, the 26.2 miles, is about 4 hours and 54 minutes, about 5 hours. If you've ever watched people, and I was watching a little bit of this in the Olympics when it was going on, and watching some of these people do this, and like when you see them at some point, like they're suffering. And they have to push to get through. And it's uncomfortable. Like most of us avoid things that are suffering. If you think about it, we avoid things in our life that has to deal with suffering. I look at a bicycle. I get winded. I know my body's going to cramp if I get on that. And so I avoid riding a bike, let alone 120 miles or whatever it is. We don't like suffering. If we can escape the day without suffering, it was a great day. So we don't talk about suffering in the church, especially the American church. We don't talk about what it means to suffer. I know I said something in the prayer, and Susan and I were talking about this before church, and our brothers and sisters right now that are in Afghanistan, our Christian brothers and sisters are suffering greatly. Most of them stepped out of their house to go to church today, not knowing if they'd ever step back outside that church. Most of them are hiding somewhere, trying to spread this gospel, not knowing if their kids will be taken from them, if they're going to be tortured, if they're going to be thrown in prison, or if they're just going to be killed right there on the spot. Most of the tolerance right now in Afghanistan for Christians is this: if you're caught being a Christian, you're executed immediately. Yet in the American church, if it rains, it affects our numbers in Sunday morning service. We try to avoid suffering. What's crazy is when you look at the New Testament and you look at the Christ-following people there, every one of them suffered. And it's not just one or two books that talk about suffering. All through it is suffering. I mean, Paul's writing from prison right now. There's a book that some in the church are reading. If there's ever a book that I would encourage you to read right now, it's Francis Chan's book, Letters to the Church. And he says this in the middle of it. He says, the fact that this suffering is such a major theme throughout the New Testament, yet such a lost concept within our churches, is a huge problem. The more I study the gospel, the more I am convinced that those of us who live in the United States have this warped view of what it means to be a Christian. Later on, he says this. He says, millions of people in our country who call themselves Christians because they believe a Christian life is about admiring Christ's example, not realizing it's a call to follow it. There's an extremely, extremely important thing here. Suffering equals participation. But we don't just pursue suffering for suffering's sake. We pursue Jesus. And we realize that there might be suffering that happens in our lives. Paul, as he's writing in chapter 2 to this church in Colossians, he says, verse 1, it's on your screen, it says, "For I want you to know how greatly I am suffering for you, for those in Laodicea, for all who have not seen me in person." Paul's in prison, he's suffering. I'm sure this wasn't the life that Paul chose, or this life he chose. It's not the life that he imagined he would have. If you know anything about history, if you know anything about Paul, Paul was actually a guy that was pretty well off. He kind of had it made. He was one of those guys. When Stephen was stoned and he was persecuting Christians, you remember he was the guy that stood in the back that kind of had everybody else waiting. Like he had people doing his dirty work for him. That's the kind of power and prestige and stuff that he had for him. And so I think when he became a Christian and when he became a Christ follower and everything things, I think as he was mapping out like, man, this is going to be great. We're going to go to different towns. We're going to share Jesus. We're going to take it to the Gentiles. We're going to do all this stuff. And I'm pretty sure he didn't write on his 5-year goal that 5 times he would receive 40 lashes minus 1 from the Jews. I'm pretty sure he didn't say that he would be beaten with rods or receive stonings or 3 times be shipwrecked or spend nights and days at sea. I'm pretty sure that in his list of things that he knew in his Christian life that he said, I face dangers from rivers, dangers from robbers, dangers from my own people, dangers from Gentiles, danger in the city, danger in the wilderness, danger at sea, danger among false brothers, toils, hardships, many sleepless nights, hunger, thirst, often without food, cold without clothes, not to mention other things. There's daily pressures on me, my concerns for all the church. I'm pretty sure when Paul decided that he was going to be a Christ follower, those weren't on his list of what he was going to be doing. But he explains, he says, for I want you to know how greatly I'm struggling, how greatly I'm suffering for you. And he goes on in verse 2 to explain it in Colossians. It's on the screen. I want their hearts to be encouraged, to join together in love so that they may have all the riches of the complete understanding and have the knowledge of God's mystery, Christ. In him are hidden all the treasures and of the wisdom and of knowledge. For Paul, he wanted people to know Jesus. And he didn't care what was going to happen. He didn't care that his life was going to have all of this stuff in it. That he'd be writing letters from prison. He didn't seek out suffering. But he realized in the pursuit of Jesus, suffering is going to be a part of it. And this is a concept that's tough for us because we don't like suffering. And so we avoid suffering. For Paul, it was for people. His love for God was so strong that he loved people. It was his love for Christ that got him into prison, but it was his love for the people that kept him going once he was there. I wonder sometimes, I wrote a statement in my notes, and it's a tough statement to swallow, because it says if you're not suffering at some point of your life because of your faith, maybe you're not participating in the gospel. You know what? You might be admiring Christ's example, but you're not following it. if we want to see our culture reshaped by the gospel, then we have to participate in the gospel. And that means that some form of suffering will come our way. Here's the second thing you can write down. Jesus is greater than culture and tradition. Jesus is greater than culture and tradition. Some parts of culture, some parts of tradition aren't bad things. Actually, for the longest time, Jacob and I have this weird, we had this weird tradition. And every year around Christmas, my wife would put out these little things called woodland creatures. And it was like these things, and I don't know where she got them, but they were, about this big. And there was like a squirrel, and there was like, I don't know what else. I could just think of the squirrel. There's all these different kinds of woodland creatures. And she would set them up in our bathroom, and it was cool. And then Jacob and I had this wonderful idea, and I don't know who started it, if it was me, if it was him, but I remember one time, one of us walked into the bathroom, and they were rearranged in some weird way. And it got intense, because then when one of us would rearrange it, the other one felt it was their duty to rearrange it again. It actually went pretty deep. We built props. There was times where there was what are those things? Seesaws. Yeah, that was built, and all kinds of, it was crazy. It got bad. And then at one point, I don't know where, it turned really dark with them, and I'm sure one of them was being sacrificed or something. I don't know. Don't judge me, okay? That is crazy. And I was thinking about this tradition, and then something happened, and I don't know, if the dogs ended up eating them or whatever happened, but the woodland creatures, or Jalen was like, I'm done. I am burning these because I'm so tired of it. I don't know what it was, but they kind of disappeared. It was a fun tradition that Jake and I had. And I was thinking about that, and it made me think all the way back to when I was a kid. My kid at Christmas time, when I was a kid, my parents had this huge village that they would set up. And it all started because they had this one village piece, and it said Parsons Furniture. And since my last name's Parsons, it was pretty cool, and they built this whole village. And I would, at Christmas time, would rearrange all kinds of little things in there just to make my mom go crazy. And it was fun seeing that tradition. Not all traditions are bad. Not all parts of culture are bad. The problem comes when those things become greater or more important than Christ. Tradition's not evil. Tradition can carry generations of positivity and message and legacy. Culture is not evil. There can be culture of healthy and goodnessness. However, when culture and tradition become our fixation, our obsession, then they become issues of idolatry. They become more important than sharing the gospel message, than reaching people, than serving the community, than changing and making a difference. You got to remember, when Paul was writing this church, there was all these pressures from culture that were pushing in on them. All these pressures saying, well, you can't do this, and we have our own agenda, and you need to be more accepting of this, and you need to act this way. And then there was all these things of the Jewish people that were there that were saying the same thing. They were like, you got to follow the Torah, and you have to follow this law and follow this thing, and if you're going to be a Christian, then you have to do this and you have to do that. And all of these cultures and all of these traditions were pushing in on the church, and the church was struggling. Paul saying, Jesus is greater than cultural pressures and traditions that are pushing us. And in chapter 3, he says this to the church. He says, so if you have been raised with Christ, seek the things above, where Christ is, seated at the right hand of God. Set your mind on things above, not on earthly things. For you died, and your life is hidden with Christ Jesus. He's saying Jesus is at the center. Christ is at the center of everything. He has to be at the center of everything. It was our 10-year anniversary. Jalen and I were in Charleston, South Carolina, and we were hanging out, and I wanted to do something, and sorry if you're offended by tattoos, but this is a tattoo story, so you'll have to get over it. But I got Jalen's name tattooed on my wrist, and we went into this place. It was called the Blue Gorilla. I have no idea why I still remember that name, but that's what it was called. We went into the Blue Gorilla. We were getting there, and I was like, I want my wife's name tattooed on me. And the guy was like, you're an idiot. And I was like, well, yes, but I still want Jalen's name. And he was like, no. He said, this is the biggest cover-ups that I do is people's names as a tattoo artist. And I was like, that question that he said resonated, and I was like, yeah, but it's different with us. And then he asked the $1 million question. Well, what makes it different about you? And my statement still is, for 21 years now, we've chosen to pursue God, pursue Christ first. And I think it's what has helped us in our marriage. I know it's what's helped us in our marriage. There's not been times that aren't rough. There's not times where I'm just an idiot and say the wrong things or have the wrong attitude. There's not times when, maybe Jalen gets snippy about something. There's not those times, but we've realized in 21 years that if it's not centered on Christ first, it's not going to work. Christ has to be at the center of everything. There's times when there's times when traditions start to creep in. I'm not saying those things are necessarily bad, but they become bad when those things are more important than the message of Jesus Christ. Is it hard? Yep. Do you remember how Paul started this letter? Well, just in case you forgot, it's on your screen. He is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn over all creation. For everything was created by him in heaven and on earth, the visible and the invisible, whether thrones or dominions or rulers or authorities, all things have been created through him and for him. Jesus is before all things, and by him all things hold together. Jesus also is the head of the body, the church. He is the beginning, the firstborn from the dead, so that he might come to have first place in everything. For God was pleased to have all of his fullness dwell in him, and through him, through Jesus, to reconcile everything to heaven, whether things on this earth or things in heaven, by making peace through the blood that Jesus shed on the cross. Everything has to do with Jesus. If we want to change in our culture, we got to elevate Jesus. We got to elevate the gospel message of Jesus. Because it's the gospel that reshapes our culture. I want to take a moment, and for a few minutes we're going to sit, and just 3 or 4 minutes, I want to ask you a question, and maybe you can ask somebody around you, or maybe it's ask someone at your table. If you're online, we have people ready to chat with you, and we'd love to talk with you a little bit. But here's the thing: how have you seen the gospel reshape the culture around you? How have you seen the gospel reshape the culture around you? Take a moment, talk in your tables, or talk amongst yourself in a row, or chat with someone online and ask that question to yourself or to the person beside you.
As we kind of close out our service today, I'm thinking about this idea of the gospel and culture and how it reshapes. The gospel is meant to reshape our culture. It's meant to transform us. And that's one of the things that is our goal here at this church, that we would experience transformation through Christ alone. And we believe that Jesus himself is more than capable of not only transforming our lives, but even the world around us. Amen? Like, you guys believe that too? That Christ can transform not just ourselves, but he can transform every aspect of this world. He can transform everything. And as I think about that question that was on the screen, how have you seen the gospel transform culture, or how have you seen the gospel have an impact on culture? And I keep thinking about, man, like there's so much work yet to be done. And the way that we do the work is by leaning into Christ himself. It's by spending time in prayer with him. And as a staff, we've walked through that book of letters to the church. And if you want a copy, if you are interested in what that looks like, because that's what this book talks about, this transformation of culture, not just in your own life, but in the church itself and what that looks like, let us know. We would love to get you a copy. We would love to walk through with you what that book says and how it can impact your own life. But as we close out today's service, we're going to sing this song called Spirit Lead Me. And that's our prayer today. That's how we want to leave this place, not just on our own, but with the Spirit leading us into the transformation so that we can go out and do the work of Christ. And so let's sing this song together called Spirit Lead Me.